Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to do a book haul revisit video. This is where I look back at book hauls from this month in the past to see how many of these books I have read, how many I have unhauled, how many I still want to read, and how many I might need to start thinking about unhauling. My intention with this is to be a more intentional book purchaser. It has, at least in theory, helped me get to know myself as a book purchaser and a book reader, and helped me rethink some of the ways I bring things into my library. Since I have limited space, we all have limited space, but it helps me think about how and whether or not I end up reading the books that I bring in, and also helps me manage the space by thinking about what I might want to get rid of in the future. I will say up front, I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about books, what these books are about. I'm going to have links to all of the original book hauls down below. You can check those out if you would like more information about what a book is about and all of that. In my book hauls, I read a little bit from the opening of the book as well. All that will be down below. Here, I'm really going to try to strictly stay with whether or not I've read it and if I still want to read it, and unhauls, things like that. So we're going to do October of 2021 first, then we'll do October of 2020, and then we will do October of 2019. And then just a quick note, I am actually filming this in September and scheduling it because I'm going to be gone in Italy. So you will be seeing me from the past. Hello from the past. But let's dive right in, because there are actually a lot of books to talk about in October of 2021. Traditionally, the way things go with my book haul revisits is that in 2019, which was my first full year on BookTube, I bought a lot of books. I got really excited about being on BookTube and all the books and all of that stuff. So those book hauls tend to be much larger and get smaller over time. October 2021 was a really big month. Let's get into it. The first one is Taste, My Life Through Food by Stanley Tucci. I did read this and I really enjoyed this. Joel also read this and really enjoyed this. So we also watched his TV show on CNN, Searching for Italy, and actually that was a big source of inspiration for some of the restaurants that we want to eat at while we are in Italy, when we're in some of the places that he has visited. And this is not necessarily a crossover with the show, although it is sort of like a life story through food, and it is very interesting from that perspective. It's not heavy on Hollywood gossip, which is actually good for me because I feel like that's the area where celebrity memoirs tend to start sort of managing their profile and giving you a public relations spin on their life and what happens to them, because they don't want to offend anybody or, open themselves up to criticism or liability. It makes it feel honest, and I always appreciate that in a celebrity memoir. So I did read Stanley Tucci's Taste, My Life Through Food. I enjoyed it. I believe it was one of my favorite reads from last year. I believe it was one of Joel's favorite reads from last year as well. So this was definitely a success story to kick off this book haul revisit. The next one is also a success story. Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World by Benjamin Alire Sáenz. I read this and Joel read this. We both loved it. I can't remember if it was Joel's favorite read of last year. I'll put a link to that video down below if you would like to check it out. It was definitely up there for me, which is actually a good thing because I had a rocky experience reading it at the time. Flashback 1 year ago, I was having a bit of a difficult time reading. I was feeling stressed and anxious because we were getting ready to travel to try to see if anybody could do anything about the brain tumor that Guinness had. So it was a tough period for reading. And I took a very long time to get through this book. I wasn't sure I was liking it in the beginning, and then I really came around it because it does feel like it portrays a sort of ideal world. People react to things in the best case scenario a lot of the time, but I ended up really appreciating that. It's such a great view of the world and people trying to be their best, and I really appreciated that. I loved it. It was, I think, my second favorite read from last year. It was definitely top 5. Again, I will link the video down below if you'd like to check it out. So this was another success story. It's going to get a little more, I don't want to say grim from here on out. Let's just say less successful in the reading department, but still successful in the aspiration department. The next one is Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. I have not gotten around to this. This is actually the first book by Colson Whitehead that I have ever owned. I have read 2 of his books, both of the ones that have won Pulitzers, Underground Railroad and The Nickel Boys. I would like to read this still. My whole thing with this is that I want to read it, I just don't feel in any rush to do it, and that continues now. I'm totally fine keeping it on my shelf. I would like to get to it at some point. I don't have any urgency to do that. So I'll get to it when I get to it, and it's totally fine living on my bookshelf until I do get to it. The next one is Please Don't Sit on My Bed in Your Outside Clothes, essays by Phoebe Robinson. I'm a super fan of the old podcast that they haven't done it in years, Two Dope Queens. Phoebe Robinson co-hosted that, and she's so funny. I love that podcast. Sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, I will just go back and listen to old episodes of that podcast because it makes me laugh, and I love it. Phoebe has gone on to a great career, and one of the interesting things that she has done is she started her own publishing imprint called Tiny Rep Books. This was the very first book from that imprint, and I bought it to support her and to support the imprint, even though I know I am much more likely to listen to this on audio than I am for the physical book. So, you could look at this and say, maybe you didn't need to buy the physical book if you're intending to get to the audio at some point, but it wasn't really about that. It was more about supporting her and this new endeavor. So Tiny Rep Books, Tiny Reparations books, the idea is to spotlight stories that have been overlooked by the publishing industry in the past and authors who have been traditionally overlooked. Of course, that means people of color, people of different sexualities and genders, all kinds of things like that. I think it's a really great initiative. That was actually part of the idea behind Two Dope Queens, to focus on comics and highlight their material who are not white men. They would have white men on the podcast, but they really focused on minorities and people from the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And I really love that. And I love that she has continued to do that in her career. So I'm totally fine having this book on my shelf in order to support her. I will get to it at some point, likely on audio. So at some point it will happen. It just hasn't yet. The next one is Monster in the Middle by Tiphanie Yanique. I have not gotten around to reading this. I still do want to. I think the urgency to read it has died down over the last year, but I still definitely want to get to it. So this is something that I'm going to hold on to and hopefully we'll be getting to fairly soon. The same is true of A Dutiful Boy, a memoir of secrets, lies, and family love. I believe I heard about this book from Jen the Librarian. This is by Mohsin Zaidi. And I really want to read this book at some point. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. I ordered this copy from the UK, and I am totally happy holding on to it until I do get around to reading it. The next one is something that was sent to me by the good people at Knopf, which doesn't really happen to me all that much. It's Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait by Nick Davis. I believe Nick Davis is related to the Mankiewicz family in some way, but it doesn't say that in the description. So I love old Hollywood. I love old Hollywood movies. I love the Oscars. Herman and Joe Mankiewicz are definitely people who fall into that. They are most famous for Citizen Kane, All About Eve, many other things. And this is a story about them and their relationship and how they both ended up in Hollywood. I am much more likely to read this on audio, but I'm still looking forward to getting to it at some point. So I haven't gotten to it yet, but I hope to. The next one is Sankofa by Chibundu Onuzo. Still looking forward to reading this. I have not gotten around to it, and I would like to. So I'm happy keeping it on my shelf until I do. I don't think anything in my 2021 book haul is in danger of being unhauled anytime soon, and the same goes for The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. I've still never read a book by Amor Towles. It gets a little confusing because everybody has a different idea where you should start. Some people say A Gentleman in Moscow. Some people say The Lincoln Highway. Some people say Rules of Civility. I don't know what to do. Someday I'm going to figure it out. This is the only one of his books that I actually own, so it has a leg up on the competition. Actually, no, that's not true. I have A Gentleman from Moscow. So they both have a leg up on Rules of Civility, but we'll see what happens. I still intend to read one of his books. Could be this one, could be one of the others. And as such, that is totally fine hanging out on my bookshelf until I do get around to it. So I brought 9 books into my library in October of 2021. Of those, I have read 2, the first 2. Those were really great success stories, though. I loved Stanley Tucci's book. I loved Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World. And I have intentions to read all of the other 7 books. There have been no unhauls, and there is not a single book from that list that I am thinking about unhauling anytime soon. This time next year, if I haven't read some of them, maybe I'll be thinking a little bit differently. But right now, I'm happy having all of them. Let's go to October of 2020. This is a much smaller book haul. October 2020 is actually the smallest book haul in this grouping, but it's a good one. The first book from October of 2020 is Love by Toni Morrison. I've really been ramping up my reading of Toni Morrison in the years since she died, and I'm so glad I'm finally getting around to a lot of them. I had only read one of her books before she died, I believe. I can't remember if I managed to read The Bluest Eye before we lost her or not. But in recent years, I've really been trying to get to her work a lot more. This I purchased specifically because I decided to do a buddy read with Britta Bowler of it. We did do that. I will say, of the Toni Morrison books that I have read, this is probably my least favorite. However, my least favorite Toni Morrison is still better than a lot of books on the market in the world, and I'm not going to name them, but I'll just drop that little bomb. Yes, so I did read this. It was not as successful as other Toni Morrisons, but I'm also not going to get rid of it because I love the idea of having a little Toni Morrison section on my bookshelves. I think she is definitely worthy of that kind of an honor. The next one is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. I did read this book when it won the Pulitzer Prize. I believe I read it after it won the Pulitzer Prize. And I remember at the time, when was this book published? 2004, 2005? Let's find out. Copyright 2004. So it would have won the Pulitzer in 2005, which is probably when I read it. So I was in my early 20s, and I thought the writing was beautiful, but I was only okay on the book. So this is one that I definitely want to revisit as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I've always had that in my mind because I think my opinion of this book is very likely to have changed over time since I read it for that first time in my early 20s. And I was thinking about that. So when I picked this book up in a store, the first page, that first paragraph, almost brought me to tears. This little section right there, because it's really about fatherhood and mortality. And at my age now, I'm much more attuned to that kind of a conversation. So I'm really looking forward to rereading this book. I have not yet, but I want to do it sometime soon as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, where I'm trying to read or reread all the books that have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I don't know if I'm going to reread all the ones that I've already read because I had already read a chunk of them. This is definitely one that I want to reread because I think my appreciation of it will have really grown in the years since it was originally published and I originally read it. And then we have my beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deesha Philyaw. If you follow along with this channel, you know I read this book. I loved this book. I talk about this book a lot. It's really great. It is a story collection. It's so good. I would have loved it if this had ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. It wasn't even really in contention. It was not a finalist. I don't know how close it would have even gotten. I'm imagining it probably didn't get close, but it's so good. It's so good. I love this book. So this is a great success story. And that lets you know why, even though the 2020 book haul is small, it is mighty. Because I think I'm going to really love Gilead when I pick that back up. And Toni Morrison, even though Love is definitely not my favorite of her books, I just love her. The next one was actually an unhaul, but I did read it. It's Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. I think 2020 was actually a bad time because we were in the height of the election. We were heading into the election day and pandemic was going on. There was so much, and this book tapped into a lot of the anxiety that I had about the world. So maybe I was a little unfair based on that experience of the book, but ultimately I think there were good observations. There were good aspects of it. I don't didn't like the way the book turned out enough that I got rid of it. So we have my first unhaul from this book haul revisit. But I did read it, so that's not bad. Then we have Whatever Happened to Interracial Love, stories by Kathleen Collins. Have not gotten around to reading this yet, but I still would like to. And it's just a tiny little thing, so it shouldn't be difficult to get to at some point. It is only about 170 pages. So someday, when I'm looking for something light, quick, I'll pick this up. And I'm totally fine keeping it on my shelves until I do manage to do that. So in October of 2020, I brought 5 books into my library. I've read 4. The only outlier is Whatever Happened to Interracial Love. I will say, though, there's a bit of an asterisk next to Gilead because I had already read it when I brought it into my library. I have not read it since I brought it in. I used to own a copy. I think I got rid of it because I didn't love it. So when I moved and downsized my library, it was one of the books that didn't make the cut. I wish I had held on to it now, but hindsight is 2020. So there has been one unhaul from that, and that was Leave the World Behind, but I did read it before it left my library. Now we get to October of 2019. Actually, this book haul is the same size as October of 2021. There are just more unhauls, so it appears smaller. We'll get into it. 2019, as I said, I was really excited to be on BookTube and books in general, so I ended up purchasing a lot. It's a wild ride. The first one is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I have not read this. I have seen and enjoyed the movie in the past. I would like to read Rebecca. I've heard a lot of really good things about it here on BookTube, so it's definitely going to happen someday. I think when I purchased it in 2019, I had a notion that it would be kind of Victober/spooky season adjacent enough that it would be a good time to read it. So I had every intention of reading it within the next month. But if you follow along, you know that I am terrible at TBRs. So it hasn't happened yet. But I do still want to read it. And because it is a classic, it's going to be just fine hanging out on my bookshelves until I do manage to get around to it. The next one is The Longest Journey by E.M. Forster. This is one of the only E.M. Forster books I have not read yet. I saw a copy at my local used bookstore in this kind of vintage-y cover. And I have not gotten around to reading it yet, but I would like to. And I do have something coming up that means it will likely be happening next year. Stay tuned for more about that. But yeah, haven't gotten to it yet, but I do have plans. And even if I don't get to it next year for some reason, totally fine, because I think E.M. Forster is my favorite author. So, of course, kind of like Toni Morrison, I'm glad to have an E.M. Forster section within my library. That takes us to Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. I've heard good things about this book, but I read a Kevin Wilson book this year called Now Is Not the Time to Panic, and I didn't really like it. And the feedback that kind of echoed onto Nothing to See Here didn't make me feel confident enough that it would be better, so I ended up unhauling it. Sorry. It's too late to change my mind now. I have heard some good things about it. I just, based on that experience of the new book, I didn't really feel like I needed to get to another one of his books. And the feedback from people who commented on my videos, it didn't convince me that it was something I need to hold on to and get to. And if I do, audio would probably be fine, library would probably be fine. It also happens that the W's, like the end of the alphabet, I always need a lot of space in my library. So there's less of a willingness to hold on to things that I might not get to or might not like, and I'm just generally not feeling enthusiastic about. So this was a casualty of that. The next one is The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I was really excited about this book when it was published in 2019. I did not get around to reading it. And feedback has been fairly mixed on it, so I don't feel in a rush to get to it. In fact, now, 2 years later, the urgency has died down a lot. So there's potential that if this is still here next year, I might start thinking about an unhaul. But for now, it's totally fine hanging out here. I have read or I listened to the audio of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is a great book. I believe this was his first novel. So still interested in getting to it. If it's still here over the next year or 2 years and I haven't read it, maybe, but I do still want to read it. And I loved Between the World and Me, so I'm definitely eager to get to Ta-Nehisi Coates' fiction and see how that treats me. Next one is also an unhaul. It is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. Actually, I sent this to Erica from The Broken Spine because she was interested in it. And I just thought, it's a really big brick of a book, and I didn't have immediate plans to get to it. And it's, because of its length, it's a big commitment. I didn't feel so enthusiastic about it. I grabbed it because it seemed like a good spooky season novel, or maybe like in winter, if you're cozying up on a couch with a puppy, it seemed like it would be a good time to read it. And then I just never did. So earlier this year, I was talking to Erica and decided to send it to her. So that's what happened, and it's fine. The next book is Find Me by Andre Osman. I was so excited about this at the time. I did have a little bit of skepticism because Call Me by Your Name is a book that does not need a sequel. It's kind of perfect the way it ends. You don't really need to know more. So I was a little suspicious of the urge to suddenly write a sequel years later after there has been a movie that has been a success and there is talk of sequels to the movies. So yeah, but I was too excited to pass it up, so I immediately bought a copy. Joel read it when it first came out and hated it. And then I heard a lot of similar feedback on BookTube as well. So between his thoughts on the book and what other people were saying about it, I pretty quickly said, ooh, I'm probably better off leaving this alone. I did start the audio about a year later and hated it the first 2 chapters, so I stopped. And that gave me the courage to say, you know what, I don't need to keep this on my shelf. So it's gone. It's fine. We're all going to be okay. The next one is also an unhaul, but I did read it. It's A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. I did this as a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac. In fact, the fact that it was a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac is actually the only reason that I finished the book, because I really didn't like it. He really didn't like it. So basically, we were just kind of hating on the book together. And ironically, the fact that we were hating on the book and having fun hating on it is what encouraged us both to finish it. Sean, the Empress of Bailing, finished a book. I did that. I am proud of that. I'm going to always have that in my corner. I got him to finish a book that he didn't like because we were having fun making fun of it. You got to take what you can get. The next book is Duck's Newbury Report by Lucy Ellman. I was really excited about this when it made the long list for the not the National Book Award, the Booker Prize. And when it made the short list for it, there was so much great feedback about it. I was struggling to fit it in. I had gotten it from the library and I did read, I think, the first 100 to 200 pages of it, but I just knew I wasn't going to get it in the time when it was going to be due back to the library. So I decided to get my own copy of the book so I could go at my own pace. And then I kind of had intentions to get to it maybe in like winter 2020, and it never happened, and it has not happened. So I still want to read this book. It takes up a lot of real estate on my shelf, but I still want to read it. I am going to get to Duck's Newbury Report someday. Don't know when, don't have plans to do it anytime immediately, but I do want to get to it at some point. The final book in October of 2019's book haul is Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home by Nora Krug. This is a graphic novel that I saw in a bookstore, and the employee there, I was looking through it and the employee told me how much they loved it. And I love a graphic memoir. I love books that deal with generational trauma and secrets and complicated family dynamics. So basically, Nora Krug is German. She does not live in Germany anymore. And she goes to do research into what her family was doing during World War II, discovers some positive things, some uncomfortable truths. It's really interesting. Some of the layout choices are a little annoying. Like it's a mixed media graphic memoir. There are like actual photos and maps and things. Sometimes the layout gets a little too tricky. I'm looking for an example of the book. or of that in the book. And of course, now that here we go. So you have this drawing in the middle, and the way the text is broken out is just a little annoying. And it happens enough that, is it a big deal? No. Is it ideal? No. But it's a good book. It's interesting enough that I've kept it. And it has a lot of interesting points. So I'm glad I got it, glad I read it, and I don't have any plans to get rid of it. So I read 2.5 books out of that 9. Those 2.5 books are Belonging, A Ladder to the Sky, and then a little bit of Find Me. Unhauled, 4 out of 9. Not a great track record for that. But if we look at the overall from all of these book hauls, I brought 23 books into my library from the last 3 Octobers. Of that 23, I have read 8.5 books. Still have some work to do, but that's a good start. And of those 23 books, I've only unhauled 5. So that's pretty good as well. And I don't have any immediate plans to get rid of any of the other ones. I've done a pretty good job bringing books into my library over the last 3 Octobers. So that is it for this book haul revisit. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these books that I have talked about. Let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.